on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here to talk to you about the making of Star Wars, the definitive story behind the original film, written by J.W. Rinsler. This is a little over 400 pages. There is a lot of information in this book. If you ever found yourself wondering what was it like making the first Star Wars movie, this book will probably give you more information than you ever wanted. Some of this book is really fascinating to me, and some of it, if I'm being honest, I didn't care about nearly as much. For me, I am more interested in storytelling than I am filmmaking, and so a lot of this book is about obstacles that George Lucas and the team at Industrial Light and Magic had in making the movie. How they had to create a lot of new technology to make the vision that George Lucas had in his head. And so whenever it talks about creating a new type of camera, or whenever it's talking about we revolutionized this particular special effect, that stuff is probably much more fascinating to people who are really into that aspect of filmmaking. That has never been something that appeals to me as much. I am always much more interested in the actual story, script writing. How does the script go from this draft to what ended up on screen? I'm much more interested in all of that. But this also covers casting stuff. I had heard rumors for a very long time about different actors who tried out or who were considered for some of the roles, and this gets into a lot of that. This talks about how at the time this came out, Harrison Ford wasn't really an actor necessarily. He had been in movies. He was in American Graffiti, also directed by George Lucas, but he wasn't a big name. He wasn't really known. And his casting was more or less accidental. There was someone else working on the film who really wanted Harrison Ford to be Han Solo, so he hired Harrison Ford to do some carpentry work on the movie, to build some of the sets and stuff, so that he could be in George Lucas's mind. And then Lucas eventually said, okay, we're going to let Harrison Ford read with some of the other actors trying out. And then he kind of got a feel for the character of Han Solo, and eventually George Lucas just gave in and said, okay, let's just cast Harrison Ford. So there's interesting stuff here. You may have heard some of these stories before, but then this might put some of those legends that you've heard into a new light. There is a lot of material here. Like I said, really probably too much for me to dissect in one video. This is over 400 pages, but the book ends about 300 something pages in. There is about about 100 pages of appendices. And I will say some of the appendices here, appendices, I don't know, some of them probably could have been integrated into the main portion of the book a little better. There is a good chunk here that is basically dissecting, okay, here's what happens in the very first draft, and then here's the second draft, and here's how it's different. And it doesn't actually have a complete draft of any of these. It will have portions of each draft, and then the author will kind of talk about, okay, here's a new element in this draft that's different from the previous one. And it kind of moves along. There's 4 or 5 summaries of the different drafts that George Lucas had, how character names would change. You had characters who were in it at the beginning, and then they got phased out as the drafts moved closer to what we got. I feel like a lot of that could have been integrated into the main narrative, if you will, where we're starting with George Lucas trying to secure funding, and then he hires a couple of writers, I don't know how to pronounce their last name, the Hyuks. It's Hyucks. I don't know how to pronounce that, but they kind of helped fine-tune the story a little bit with dialogue, and those are some names you almost never hear about now. Whenever you hear about people involved with the making of this trilogy, I had heard of is it Ralph Marquand? Richard Marquand, Irv Kershner, there's Gary Kurtz. I had heard of all these people who kind of helped guide the trilogy. George Lucas was the big guy behind everything, but then a lot of these other people, they had pretty fundamental roles that they played in the making of Star Wars as well. It kind of reminds me of the story, what is the most important part of the car? And you might be tempted to say the engine, but then really the answer is the most important part of the car is the part that you need right now. So if you're out in the middle of the desert and it hasn't rained for 3 months, you're not going to need your windshield wipers. But then, if you're in a monsoon, suddenly the windshield wipers are the most important part of the car. And so a lot of people are tempted to say George Lucas is the most important person in the making of Star Wars. And certainly without him, there would not be a Star Wars. He is the one who came up with the idea and was really pushing for this movie to be made. But also, Alan Ladd Jr., that's a name that you don't hear a lot about nowadays. He was an executive at Fox, and he was probably the only person who unequivocally was in George Lucas's corner. There were other people, even people working on the movie, who I don't think believed in the idea of Star Wars as much as Alan Ladd Jr. And so that's a name that I don't think gets enough recognition and praise for his part in making this movie happen, for trying to help George Lucas make his vision come true. There are also a lot of other people that this talks about. This goes into the people who were kind of working at Industrial Light and Magic while Lucas was in Tunisia filming, and it's a weird situation where I kind of feel for both parties, because George Lucas mentions at one point while he was filming Industrial Light and Magic, they were seeing themselves more as a laboratory where they could test this out, and if it doesn't work, okay, we'll try something else, and they weren't doing as much of completing the special effects shots that he wanted them to do. But on the other hand, George Lucas had this idea in mind for a movie that had never been made before. Nothing like this had ever been done before. As far as special effects are concerned, this was breaking new ground. And George Lucas had something in mind, but it was impossible for these people who could not read his mind to make that happen. So they were trying their best, but then George Lucas comes back from filming, and in 8 weeks they have completed 2 shots, and Lucas said neither of them were usable. And so it's a weird situation where you get to see some of the people talking in this that were interviewed. They're very candid. A lot of the material here, I think, comes from interviews that were around the time the movie came out. Even though this book came out sometime in the 2000s, post Lord of the Rings, because it's got a Peter Jackson foreword here, even though this came out sometime in the last, I would say, 15 years probably, this uses a lot of material from the time, the late 70s, early 80s. And you see a lot of people talking about, like, yeah, I didn't really get along with that guy. He didn't really step back and let me do my job, or he was kind of getting in the way. I didn't really think that what he was doing was necessary. You get to see a lot of that, and it's interesting because nowadays, if you watch a video on YouTube where some people are talking about the making of Star Wars, especially if they're talking about it now, they're not going to be as candid and as frank talking about this. So there is a lot here that is really interesting, and I will say, even for me, and I'm not as much into the filmmaking part of making movies, I was still interested in this book. There was a lot of really cool stuff to find out here. At the end of the book, there are some, I guess, interviews that George Lucas did where it was after he had allegedly retired, where he said that after making Star Wars he was done and he wasn't going to make any more movies, and then that ended up not being true, and I'm not upset about that or anything, but I think eventually he realized, yeah, I kind of want to get back into making movies again. But for a little while, he wanted to guide the world of Star Wars without necessarily going through the heartache of making another movie. And so he did some interviews with someone where he was expanding on the backstory of Star Wars, talking about characters like Han Solo, Princess Leia, and Chewbacca. Or I'm sorry, not Chewbacca, C-3PO. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff there that, I mean, this would have been like 1978, I think, when he did some of this expanding the world of Star Wars, and it is crazy to me how much of what eventually made its way into the prequels is there in a lot of this expanding the world stuff. Princess Leia talks about how the Emperor became the Emperor, and at this time, nobody knew that the Emperor was a Force user, but the idea that the Emperor was a senator and the Chancellor was a temporary position, this says the Chancellor role was re-elected every 4 years, and you typically were not a Chancellor for more than one term. But then this one guy became Chancellor, and it doesn't even have the name Palpatine at this point. This guy became the Chancellor, and then a catastrophe happened, a crisis, and so he was able to finagle things. He was able to buy a few senators and make it so that he could be Chancellor for a second term, because it would be really disastrous for someone else to come in the middle of this big crisis. And that's pretty much what happens in the prequels. This talks about how Darth Vader betrayed the Jedi, and this makes it a little different than how it plays out in Revenge of the Sith, where the annihilation of the Jedi Order kind of happens all at once. But this makes it seem like it was a little bit more more of a slow burn, how Darth Vader was still considered to be a friend of the Jedi, and he would maybe be with a Jedi on this one planet and then stab him in the back, and then he would go and find another Jedi who didn't know that he was a traitor, and then he would kill that Jedi. And so this makes it seem like it was more of a long-term eradication of the Jedi Order. But there's also, C-3PO says he is like 173 years old, and he talks about how he wasn't always a protocol droid, and there's all this stuff he mentions, and I was thinking, man, none of this is like what happened with 3PO in the prequels, but then there's like one sentence where he says that he was rebuilt by this boy in a junkyard, and I was thinking, that's pretty much what happens in The Phantom Menace. Now, in Phantom Menace, if I'm not mistaken, Anakin said he built a protocol droid to help his mom, so that doesn't seem to line up with the idea that 3PO is 173 years old, and Rinsler does say, before he gets into a lot of this, that none of this is canon anymore, that these are just ideas George Lucas had at the time, and some of it seems to have kind of stuck, and some of it kind of went away. Almost none of Han Solo's backstory remains canon as of Solo, a Star Wars story. But there's a lot of this that's really interesting. Princess Leia mentions that she has 2 younger brothers who may or may not have died when Alderaan was destroyed. I thought that was really interesting. This was back when nobody knew that Princess Leia was Luke's sister, but she says, you know, maybe my brothers weren't on Alderaan when it was destroyed, but I don't know. I've lost contact with everyone who might know. And so that's kind of an interesting idea. It makes me think maybe Lucas, at one time when he thought there would be more than 3 Star Wars movies, maybe he would eventually say the royal family of Alderaan lives on through her brothers. Maybe they're out there somewhere. That's an interesting idea that I feel like he was toying with, and maybe he threw that away whenever they got more into Empire Strikes Back. But a lot of really interesting stuff here. I really enjoyed reading this book. It is a little hard to come by. If you look this up on eBay, it's going to be like in the $40, $50 range. I was able to get it quite a bit cheaper than that. So if you see this book in a bookstore somewhere, a used bookstore out in the wild, I would strongly recommend that you get this book. I definitely learned new things about Star Wars. This kind of put into perspective some things that I didn't know. And I feel like even if you think you know everything about Star Wars, I would say you will still learn something new from reading this book. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think aspiring filmmakers should definitely look into this. Aspiring storytellers, this will definitely tell you, even if you are just wanting to be a screenwriter and you don't want to be involved with shooting the movie and all the practical stuff that goes into making a movie, this will still tell you you're very likely going to lose your soul in the process of making your movie happen. You're going to definitely be kind of broken down and heartbroken because everything you wanted to see happen is not going to happen. So this is a very eye-opening book for me. I really like this book. I hope you guys like this video on the making of Star Wars, and I will see you guys in the future with some more videos. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.